Okay, perfect. Petra, thank you for hopping on. Little context. I've heard you in a couple podcasts, and I've heard your ability to really scope and provide value. And I was like, we need you just to brain dump for us. So first off, thank you so much. Where are you sitting right now?
Well, I'm actually based in Adelaide, Australia, and I'm in my home office.
Gotcha. And let's hear just the quick little elevator pitch on what you do.
So I specialize in Google Ads and analytics. So that encompasses the actual advertising side of things, but also setting up Google Tag Manager and any analytics reports that businesses might want as well.
Gotcha. And so what was Petra like pre-freelance?
Alrighty. Well, I was a software nerd. I was actually working in Department of Defense doing Java programming and Python programming. And so I was working in like immediately prior to starting this freelance gig, I was working in cybersecurity, creating heat maps for cybersecurity data. So that's what I was doing. But it's not so much that I hated it. I actually really liked the work, but it was a really long drive to get there. And literally, you'd walk into this office in the middle of nowhere, and there would be grills on all the windows to stop any terrorists from getting in. And all of the people that I worked with were all they're all data scientists as well, and they're all lovely people, I promise. But I too, there was only so much that I could talk about Pokemon Go without going a little bit nuts, especially given that I have never played Pokemon Go. So it just wasn't quite the same social scene as I wanted to be in. And it was also, I wasn't allowed to have my mobile phone in the office either because of it all being top secret. So I was pregnant at the time, and I was worried that someone would call me for a health appointment and I wouldn't know about it. So no, it wasn't going to work out. I'd been dreaming about my escape for a while. So I thought, no, I'm going to have to go and start a freelance business.
So, okay, you just answered the next question on why freelance, and the answer is so you can have your mobile phone, so you can actually hit Instagram while you're at work. Okay, cool.
Well, actually, I had started businesses much earlier anyway. So my very first career, I guess, had actually been a mortgage broker. And so I was 19. I skipped out of uni, and then straight up I started earning income of like $100,000 as a 19-year-old coming out like as a self-employed, because I bought a franchise.
Whoa.
And I'm like, this self-employment stuff, if you can get it right, it's really cool, because I didn't know any other 19-year-olds earning that. So I bought my first house when I was 20. Like I was like on the path, and then I ended up going into corporate because that business didn't really work out. I started a couple of other businesses, but they didn't really work out, and I didn't really know what I was doing. So I went back and became a computer programmer, which I enjoyed for a while. I did that for a decade or so.
Gotcha. Okay, so you did that's super interesting. So you started as a business owner. One of the questions I'm going to ask later is the difference between being a business owner and a freelancer, because there's obviously lots of parallels. But before that, how did you get into freelancing? So how did you go from software developer to running what you do now?
Yeah, sure. So essentially, I knew that a service business was one of those businesses where you just have to get started quickly. So the first thing that I did was literally go and start meeting people. I didn't worry about business cards, or like I put up a bit of a website, but honestly, it was like version 1 website, it was not really that great. But essentially, I just went to as many networking groups as I could. I just signed up for every single networking group that you can imagine. Uh, like obviously all local things at this point in time, because I didn't have any online audience at all. I didn't have a blog. I didn't have anything. So one of the first groups that I went to was one called BNI, and I know BNI is international. Um, I joined BNI actually, and I was there for a year. But I also went to pretty much all the coffee clubs that you can imagine, and just met lots of people. And I also hopped onto LinkedIn, and I reached out to lots of people on LinkedIn and just said, hey, I'm a new freelancer. This is what I'm doing. Do you want to meet up? And I'd just meet up with people. We'd have coffee or whatever. They'd describe what they did. I'd describe what I did. And I started getting referrals that way. So I built up new clients very, very quickly.
And so did you like do the jump and just go straight to being a freelancer, or did you take on a couple of projects while you had a full-time job? What did sort of the leap look like?
No, that wasn't really going to happen. Full-time job. It was such a long commute
Gotcha.
to get to the, top secret hideout. And I was exhausted and I was pregnant anyway. So I started freelancing when I was about 36 weeks pregnant. I went on my maternity leave and I thought, well, I'll just kind of start business. And I didn't really start trading then. It was more like doing a bit of research. I was like listening to heaps of podcasts to hear what other people were doing, just kind of getting that intel. And then when my daughter was 4 months old, that was when I started trading. So essentially by that stage, it was funny. I was going to some of these networking groups with my baby in tow. So I was like, I might as well start now. So I would just drag her along. And then I found out that BNI had a rule that they weren't allowed to have babies in a BNI meeting. So, but I just like stuck her on my back and I was like wandering around to different places, like handing out, getting people's business cards and chatting to people, and she's just on my back and yeah, might as well.
So
I mean, she's
did
just
they
a
allow
baby,
dogs,
right?
or yeah, did they allow dogs, or I mean, is this a clear like nothing besides just humans, or
Well,
what's
they
going
didn't
on?
want to have interruptions. And I was even doing like, I just figured like, whatever. So it's my business. It's, my life. So I was even going to coffee meetings with her when she was really young. And sometimes she'd want to nurse or something. I just brought a nursing cover and I'd be, having, it was a bit random. But especially if I was meeting with other women, they didn't mind. They thought it was refreshing.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And so how did you know? How did you start to know what your freelance offering slash skill slash how did you go from I'm going to be a freelancer to I'm actually going to get paid? Like what did it look like to start to know what someone was going to pay you for?
Yeah, sure. Well, being a programmer probably gives you the confidence in knowing that you can solve problems, because the main thing that a programmer does is go from not knowing how to do something to knowing how to do it. And like half of what you're doing as a programmer is research, or like either researching how to fix something or researching what the problem is. And then you can go, oh, now I know what the problem is. Now I can fix it. So I never had any doubt in my ability to solve a problem. And I just saw my initial problem as finding clients and finding what they wanted to pay me for. But I figured I'd stick with something that I already had close to what I was doing. And because I was working in analytics in like my previous job, I figured that most likely anything that someone threw at me with regards to analytics, I'd be able to do. Now, to be honest, at the time, I just went out there and said, hey, I can specialize in analytics. I can do anything that you want with regards to analytics. And I'd never really done anything that was related to the topics that I was saying I could do. But I knew that I could solve the problem. So I had people coming up to me saying, yeah, can you do this, that, and the other? And I'd be like, yes. And then after I got the work, then I'd be like, ooh, how am I going to do this? So then I'd figure it out, which meant, to be honest, it made it really hard when I was quoting fixed price projects, because I'd just pull some number out of my head and they'd go, yeah, that's fine. And then I'd be spending half of that time or more trying to figure out how to do it. But, I just figured it out. And as I went, I wrote down processes on how to do things. So that
Gotcha.
way I didn't have to reinvent the wheel each time.
Gotcha. And I'd love to hear is there some early like horror stories or funny stories where, I mean, we all have them, right? You throw out this massive number in your head and then the client says, wow, that was pretty cheap, of course. And then you realize, wow, I underpriced and I'm stuck doing a bunch of work. But so do you have any
uh,
horror stories? Yeah.
actually, I pivoted into Google Ads for that reason, because the opposite happened. Uh, Analytics is actually really hard in that people don't really value it so much. They don't realize the amount of work that goes into it. In order to get the analytics working well, there's quite a bit of custom programming to do in JavaScript, and trying to get it all right for whatever data they're going to throw at you is very time consuming, and getting the reports right, it's really fiddly. And then what I was finding is I was quoting a figure that I thought was quite reasonable, and people were complaining that it was too high. I was hearing that all the time. It's too high. It's too high. which was actually one reason I eventually left the local networking scene, because I found that in the place where I live, people weren't really used to spending a lot of money on analytics. It's a more of a higher end corporate type of need. So I moved over to Google Ads as well, because I found that the analytics work that I was doing was helpful for that. But anyway, I've gone off track. But in terms of those horror stories, it was more the other way around, that I would quote something and then find that it took a lot longer than I was expecting it to. So I found that quite stressful, actually, because I had in my mind that I wanted to earn a certain amount of income, but I was wearing myself out because I was trying to go and meet so many people and do all the work, and I was quoting too low. And then even then, people were saying it's too high, even when I wasn't earning enough. So I'm like, what do you mean it's too high? I didn't earn much for it. But they're like, oh no, it's too high. So yeah, that was quite stressful. It took ages to get out of that funk.
That's a super super interesting and relatable problem. Is a lot of the upfront labor isn't billable. So it's not like a lawyer where you can just say this took me 10 hours and my billable rate is 500 or you name it. And so how did you start to get out of that funk? And by the way, one of the, when we were spinning up our WordPress site, right? I've always been the kind of like the Squarespace, the easier version. And then you go to WordPress and you realize there's all this work in the back end that I just didn't even, it's like magic when someone does it for you. But so in your case, right, you're doing something similar where there's a lot of magic happening in the back end. And like, how do you make sure you get paid for that magic? And the answer might be you shift to Google Ads or Google Analytics. But yeah, how do you, if you're a freelancer and is sort of ambiguous or just a lot of upfront work, how do you start to manage that?
Yeah, so I tried a whole lot of different pricing models. So what wasn't working for me, for my work, and I'm not saying that this isn't true for other people's work, but for my work, it didn't work when I did a fixed price bid, because the analytics work was so ambiguous as to what they were going to get and what their expectation was and what my expectation was. So my expectation was that I would be fixing a particular problem. Their expectation was that not only would I be fixing that problem, but I'd be helping them to get started, and I'd be walking through it with them every day, and I'd be explaining what it was that I did, and I'd be doing training and it would turn into a 30-hour job when I was thinking it was going to be like 10 hours. It turned out that in my industry, the customer handholding was much, much higher than I was expecting. And it was just because I'd come out of that computer programming way of doing things where I knew what I was doing. And I just thought that they would accept that, but they wanted the training in it all. So that didn't turn out too well. What I ended up doing to fix that was I started working in, I tried hourly rate, but I really didn't like it, because I didn't really like people contacting me out of the blue saying, can you do this job, but I only want you to spend half an hour on it. Like, I just had too many clients at once with little jobs. That was driving me batty. There was so much admin involved. So I changed to a model for the analytics side where I now bill in 10-hour blocks and they pay me up front. And then that way, I'll still give them an idea of how long something's likely to take, but I'm letting them know that any customer service or training or anything, they need to pay for that. So that it helps to keep the scope down. But in terms of the fixed price, I couldn't get it working in my industry, unfortunately.
So it's interesting, actually. It sounds like it's a hybrid of like fixed skill. So you're not hourly, you're not fixed project, but it's almost fixed skill of, hey, you need this skill. I'm not going to do all the back end, you name it. Do you ever do that? Like, do you ever still go in the weeds and do the 30 hours of more of the back end and hand holding and teaching?
I do, but I've pretty much pivoted now that almost all of my clients are Google Ads. But what I do now with the back end type stuff is I've trained team members to handle a lot of it. So all the way through, I've been writing procedures, and my procedures are very, very detailed. Where I didn't have time to write the procedure, I would record the procedure and then I'd get someone to write it for me and then I'd review it. So I've got hundreds of procedures. And so now I can just say to my assistant, I want you to do this, 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 and this. And then he'll go in and spend the 30 hours instead of me.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And I'd love to learn. So, okay, so it's just you. How did you go from it's just you doing all this work to you have the team of people, or you mentioned the assistant, or you have the teams of people? How did you get there? Because I think that's a critical part of scaling yourself that a lot of people, I mean, okay, you're a full-time employee. You don't want to be a manager. And so when you say, hey, you're now a freelancer, but you're going to go manage people, this is the whole reason you didn't, you didn't climb the ladder in full time. So how did you really scale yourself working with people while not becoming just another middle manager?
Yeah, look, I didn't have a trouble with being a manager. Just no one offered me a management role, I guess.
Mm.
And I think in computer programming roles, there's not really a lot of management roles that come out of that. It, it was actually a frustration that I had because I felt like a real leaf node. Like I wasn't able to provide value to the business. So I didn't have any problems with managing people, but I did learn very quickly on that I didn't have enough time in my day to do all the things that I needed. And I still talk to people today that are freelance that have been working for 3, 4, 5, 10 years. And they're saying to me, I didn't have any time to manage my business because I do everything. I do all the client work. I don't have time to market. I don't have time to bring on stuff. I don't have time to do all that. I'm like, well, something you could have built in from the beginning. So I worked out in the first 6 months or so of freelancing that I was going to pop if I tried to do it all myself. It just wasn't going to happen.
Yeah.
So the very first person I brought on was a virtual assistant from the Philippines. And her role was just to help me write the procedures. So that was all we did for 6 months. Oh, maybe she did a bit of like bits and bobs. Like after we created the procedures, she might have followed some of them. But pretty much all that she was doing was I was recording what I was doing. She'd turn it into a procedure. And we did that for 6 months until we had a reasonable procedure library. And then after that, I needed someone who was more experienced at the actual technical roles. I couldn't just have her doing the technical roles because she was great at like following a procedure step by step, but not when it comes to interpreting something if something goes wrong. So I needed someone a bit more experienced. So that was when, at that point I started bringing in more experienced virtual assistants. I haven't had a local team member. I've only had virtual assistants. And essentially I would train them in following my process. I've got a project management process that I use. They have to follow my process and they use my procedures. And if something goes wrong, they have the ability to kind of problem solve, but they're using that as their template for how to get the work done.
Gotcha. Okay, that helps us sort of dovetail into Quantified Web. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about what it is. Let's talk about your clients, what a typical project or what a typical workflow looks like. Yeah, let's dive into what Quantified Web does.
Yeah, sure. All right. So these days, like I said, almost all of my clients are now on the ad side just because more people need ads help. So, or more people are looking for ads help. So it just happened that once I started offering that service, my business picked up really quickly. So the majority of my clients are actually e-commerce businesses, or they are uh, health clinics that use booking apps, or alternatively, they sell products of some sort. So I consider them to be, so they also hotels and things. So I consider them to be transactional businesses. And the distinction there is they're not really running a service where someone's coming to them by referral. They're actually selling directly from their website. So that's what most of my clients look like. And then because I've got that analytics background, I'm actually integrating the analytics into their Google Ads service delivery. So where I've got my expertise is, let's say someone has, let's say they've got e-commerce, but then they also wholesale to a B2B client as well. Then they might have their website set up to bring e-commerce transactions into Google Ads, but they might not have all of the B2B interactions as well. And that can make a real mess of their ads because they might only be tracking revenue from one portion of their business. But if their revenue is coming from elsewhere, then that's not being tracked. So I can go in and customize any tracking in order to make sure the revenue that we're reporting on is accurate. And then that way we'll get much better ad results.
Interesting, interesting. And who? So it's very technical, right? In a good way. Who is the buyer? Are we talking about a CMO, a CIO, a director in product? What does the buyer usually look like?
Yeah, sure. So it used to be actually that when I was doing analytics, it was a bit weird because the buyer would be the end client, but the person with the problem was always a marketing agency. So I'd always get introduced from a marketing agency. But now I've got a more alignment, which is great. So the buyer is generally um, a business that's kind of medium sized. So we're not talking about one that has lots and lots of layers. The owner of the business is still involved in marketing to some degree, but they'll usually have a marketing manager who does the day-to-day marketing things, and then they bring the owner in for like making decisions. But usually the the owner of the business will be the buyer, but then I'll be interacting with either the owner of the business or a marketing manager.
Gotcha. Okay, so you will basically, so if you were in a full-time role, what would, do you know what you would be? Like, would you be a VP of marketing analytics, or are you familiar with that?
Yeah, so I've seen VP of marketing analytics and things roles, but to be honest, unless I was living in Sydney, we don't really tend to have as many really large corporations here in Adelaide. So I've never seen roles like that advertised. We would normally just have, we'd call it a marketing manager and then a marketing assistant. And so the marketing manager would be the person that's responsible for all the difficult things. And the marketing assistant would be the person that kind of helps that person out. And it's funny because even if they don't have an assistant, they're often still called a marketing manager. But when it comes to Google Ads is seen as a very technical skill. So a lot of people wouldn't have someone like that on staff. So I'd say that, and same with analytics, it just doesn't make sense to have an analytics specialist on staff unless they're a really, really big corporation. But even then, large corporations are still getting freelancers in for that type of service. So it's not really a role that I see in-house so much, which means someone who wants to freelance, they've really got to kind of learn it
Yep.
as they're going, or uh, people do courses beforehand, but unless you've been in the nitty gritty of particular problems, a course doesn't really cut it.
Yep. No, I couldn't agree more. I think so. From the client side, one of my big awakenings in terms of hiring freelancers was that, oh my God, the capacity and the output of what it would take me to have a VP of marketing analytics or something that usually is really, really expensive, we can get from just hiring freelancers or one freelancer instead. And so when I hear how technical what you do is, it's a perfect example of it's not this crazy thing, right? Like, you're not a freelancer that's just out of the blue, out of the, out of nowhere. You actually are fitting a very, very, very relevant business demand. And whether it's a VP marketing analytics or whatever it is, the business owner, which is usually, or the buyer, which is, like you mentioned, the owner, or what I said before, like maybe a CMO, they have something to compare to. So you're able to walk in and say, are you feeling pain A, B, C, D? And then they say, of course. And you say, okay, cool. Well, instead of hiring someone full time, bring me in, it'll be X price, or in your case, it was 10, the bulk hours. Super, super cool. So, okay, what does a typical project look like from start to finish? Is it someone reaches out to you via LinkedIn and then all the way to this is now my perfect client?
Yeah, sure. All right. Well, if I think about an analytics project, which is what it used to be, it would be, I'd generally get referred in from a marketing agency and they'd say, oh my goodness, I'm working with this client, nothing is tracked. And we're talking about big brands. But like you were saying, it's not affordable or sensible to have a VP of analytics on your business unless you're a humongous business. So uh, most likely nothing would be tracked, or if it was tracked, it would be broken. So they would work together to work out what the scope of the engagement was going to be, what kind of things I was going to be tracking, and I'd quote a price and I'd go off and do that. These days it's a little bit different. So now that I'm doing more of the Google Ads side of things, I'm working completely differently. I'm working on retainers, and there's an implicit trust in the fact that if I do well by my client, then they're going to want to have me working longer term. because the more results I'm getting, the better it is. So they might as well keep working with me. They're not going to suddenly stop working with me. So I tend to put a lot more in up front over and above. I don't really count it so much as an hourly. I do still track it all because I care a lot about my tracking, but I will go over and above to get things working. So when it comes to these longer term engagements, to try and make the scope a bit easier, I'll say, all right, what channels are we going to work with? So when we're doing the initial scoping, I'll prioritize the channels. So when I say channels with Google Ads, you've got text ads, you've got display ads, you've got shopping ads, you've got YouTube ads. I'll prioritize them for the client in terms of what I think is going to get the best result. And then I'll say, right, well, do you want to work on one of these at a time, two of them at a time, three of them at a time, four of them at a time? Depending on how much complexity they have, it'll change the price. So if they say, well, look, we can only really work on one at a time, then we'll pick the one that's going to be the best. We'll just focus really deeply on that, make sure that's working really great. I don't always like to just work on only one because that they all kind of play off each other, but sometimes people don't have the budget to do everything at once. That's fine. And it's more of a long-term relationship then. So then when they start to need the extra services, I'm there to say, hey, this is what I think you need next. And we have like a more of a trusting relationship. It's not transactional. So I'll be looking after them almost like a subscription service where I'm just looking after them all the time and I'm trying to keep a long-term engagement with them.
So, okay, so that alleviates the biggest concern from clients, by the way, is a client is always thinking, it already takes me long enough to onboard a full-time employee. You're telling me I'm going to bring someone in that just leaves in a week or a month or you name it. And it's one of the biggest myths is that freelancers just come in, do the work and leave and don't care. When in reality, I'd argue freelancers usually actually do better work because they have pride in the work itself and they're not going to let you down because they're so prideful of the work. My favorite analogy is actually if you go to Krispy Kreme. Do you have a Krispy Kreme in Australia, or what's your favorite
Yeah,
donut
we
place?
do.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
we do.
So like in the US, if you go to Krispy Kreme right before closing, it's going to be cold. It's probably going to be a gross donut because the employee could care less. If you go to a freelancer though and you get the same donut, it's always going to be delicious because they care so much about the actual quality. So I'd love to hear for freelancers, what are some of the levers and engines of trust? Like how do you build that trust with the client?
Yeah, sure. Well, what I actually have been doing, and this has actually been working really well for me. Initially I'd done the opposite. So initially I had been selling a package which was like a road mapping session because this is really trendy at the moment to sell a road mapping session. And what it was is basically they've got to pay to even have any of my time at all. And then I'm going to meet with them and do this road mapping. And then that way, if they don't want to go ahead, well, my time's already been covered. And like, I know that's really trendy and that's good for covering your time. But what I've started doing is the absolute opposite, where if someone looks like they're going to be a good prospect for me because I like their business, I like who they seem to be, they're going to fit in really well. I will give them quite a lot of time up front where we'll go through and we'll really talk through what their strategy is going to be. We're already building trust right from the outset. I'll give that to them completely for free. And then I go in and write a really detailed proposal. And with the proposals, I'm actually putting in like normal words. I'm not using jargon. I'm just writing it like a letter to a friend. And I'm going and I'm doing the research. I'm actually like doing research and I'm explaining it in a way that makes sense. So I'll put like a little arrow around something and I'll point to it and I'll say, see this means blah, blah, blah. And I'll put that in their proposal. I lay it all out. So it's like a letter. And then normally when they get this, they're blown away because no one's ever put that much effort into kind of wooing them before. But from my perspective, if I'm going to be developing a relationship with this person, I don't want it to be transactional right from day dot. I want to make them feel special because this is someone that I want to develop a relationship with. I wouldn't necessarily do that with every person, but certainly the people that I want to have as a client. So from that point, normally I've got a very good success rate with those proposals. Almost all of them go ahead with those proposals. And from that point forward, we've got a very trusting relationship where anytime I see something that I feel is important, I will be straight out talking to them about it. And they know that pretty much anything that they want to ask, I'll talk to them about it. So even if it's not always on topic, I'll let them know that I can find someone to help them. So I don't ever want to feel like I'm leaving them high and dry. And I even do little things like send them chocolates or like just treat them like a friend. And they really respond well to that. I get so many kind of gushes and thank yous for that. It's just, I just feel that it's part of, look, I'm not the type of person that I just go make friends with everybody. I don't hang out with them on Facebook or anything, but it's more about creating a bit of a community and intimacy with them where they feel that they can trust me and that I'm providing the best service.
Yeah, so there's three things I want to make sure I call out in you saying that. That was so awesome. I was writing down to make sure I didn't forget. But so the first is you replace the scoping with qualification. So you don't just say, hey, everyone, come to me and I'll do this road mapping session and cover my time, or cover my time. You instead put the kind of 2 hours into, okay, let's qualify. Let's make sure this is the right business unit. This is the people that I want to work with. And so you then have a sort of, hyper path of this is what I want. You then, so going beyond when you start to work together, you then become the reference point, which I think is the most underrated thing you can do from a client perspective, because if you put yourself in the client's shoes, I don't want to work with lots of freelancers. It's kind of like assuming that I want to have more than 10 directs underneath me. I probably want 2 to 5. Anything more than that, I'm going to go crazy. And so to think that now that we're hiring freelancers, that all of a sudden I'm going to want 50 freelancers this is crazy. It's not going to happen. And so you mentioned was you're always able to say, yes, I can't do this, or I can't do this, but let me put the right resources in place for you, which is so huge. And then the third thing with the chocolates is just great. That is so awesome. And one of my favorite freelancers, so I didn't know how she was doing this, but she knew me better than myself. And so literally I would jump into conversations that she would be having with freelancers that were on the team about me, about how to work with me. And I'd be like, Sam, how, like, you know me better than myself. Turns out she has an Excel spreadsheet where she has all her clients and she's listing all these specific things. And so I imagine you have something similar where, it's not just one client, it might be organic dark chocolate. The next client, it might be nice Swiss milk chocolate. So that is
I haven't
awesome.
gone down to that level, but I try to keep it all in my head. I guess if I had a lot more clients, then I might have to start writing it all down. I do have a CRM, so I guess I could put details in there, but I try to just keep it all in my head.
It'll just wait. We'll talk in about 6 months about when it becomes way too much. But awesome. Okay, so the last part is going to be sort of tips for freelancers that are either just getting started or want to experience the growth. So the first thing is just, what is the number one thing that you would say to a freelancer who is starting right now? What should they think about and focus their time on?
If they're starting right now, the number one thing they need to focus on is relationships. Ultimately, service businesses do tend to get their business from referrals. So in my case, I actually advertise, but I don't get my clients from advertising. I advertise because I want to remind my referral partners of what I specialize in. And so if I sell products, it'll be to offset the cost of my advertising, just so that I'm always in the front of my referral partners. But ultimately, it's people that hire people and it's people that refer people. So unless you know plenty of people, you're not going to get that early business. So honestly, just meet as many people as you can, find as many people to talk to as you can about what you do, and find out what they do too. Don't just make it all about yourself, but see if there's any kind of alliances that you can do. There might be some people that you meet that are doing some things that are very similar to you or very different from you, but have a similar target market and you can work together. That always works great.
I love that quote, people that hire people. That might be, we need to have like a picture of you and then just like in quotations, people that hire people or people hire people. It's awesome. That's so cool. Now, going from the people or the relationships to the tools, what would you say are the critical tools that freelancers should be using? And I'll throw in a little curveball to that. The answer can be it's actually the processes are deeper, and here are some of the key processes. So I'll frame it at what are the tools, but also allow you to, what are some of the processes driving these tools?
All right. Well, first of all, I think project management system is really important. So when I say a system, you need some software for your project management, but then also you need a systematic way that you use that software. So it's not that you're doing it one way and then someone else is doing it another way. Now, obviously, when you're first starting, it's just you. But if you can't get yourself into gear using project management software, how do you expect anyone under you to know how it should be used? So you really need to start with yourself, and you need to get into a rhythm of using that project management software to write down all the different projects and different tasks that you're doing. So the way that I use mine is I work in sprints. So every Monday I plan the sprint, which is 1 week period, and I work out what clients need work doing now. I kind of work out all the requests that I've had, how much time we've got in our projects, and I'll plan things out for the week and I'll assign it to different people. Now, I've got 2 technical assistants and 1 admin assistant. So I've got people that I'm assigning it to. But even if it was just me, I'd still just assign it to me, but I'd still have it all planned out. I think that is absolutely critical, because if you don't know what you're working on, you're going to be wasting so much time spinning your wheels. And if you don't have a system for doing it the same all the time, you're going to be wasting time on like planning when you could just get through it. You're going to need to use something like a time tracking software, because you don't want to just work for free. You do need to be finding out how much time you're actually spending on things. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to work hourly, but finding out how much time you're actually spending is super important. So part of my project management system, actually, I use some external spreadsheets that are not part of so I use monday.com for my software, but it doesn't really matter what you use as long as you've got a system. But I've also got some spreadsheets where I track what my return on investment has been from each client, how long we've been working on the project, how much they've spent with me, how many hours we've done, all of that kind of business data. I've got it all in one place. And so every week I check that we're on track in terms of return on investment and all of those things. So that then if I'm in a situation where, let's say I have to refer on a client, I know that I'd be referring on the one that's not profitable to me, for example. Or, I don't want to make it sound really crass, but there comes a point where there's going to be some clients that maybe you just don't gel with as well. But if those are probably the ones that you're not going to be getting the good return on investment. If you've actually got it all down, you can make business decisions. So sometimes you can put up with a client that you're not liking that well if you know that they're really profitable, and you need to have that data in order to make those decisions. So I think that's really important. So I'm using a tool called Sweet Process for writing down my procedures. And so I've been using that right from the beginning. I also use a tool called Confluence as a bit of a wiki. And we don't need to use that quite as much, but I use it for capturing bits of code because it doesn't store that well in Sweet Process. So for people that have got a code-based business, having an external place to put that code is good, because you can have a bit of a code library where you can say, all right, let's just copy and paste from this rather than trying to reinvent it each time. In terms of other tools, obviously there's plenty of other things that I use here and there, but those are the things that I'm in all the time.
Gotcha. Okay. So project management, tracking, you mentioned your spreadsheets, but just a way to really be benchmarking yourself for success. It sounded like some sort of skill specific ones. So you mentioned Confluence, but it could be InVision or the Adobe Suite or whatever it is for. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. You ready for the rocket round? You have 10 seconds for each question.
Sure.
Favorite place to work from?
I like working from home.
Perfect. Favorite book?
E-myth.
Email. Okay. Last one. Ready? Favorite animal.
Cat.
Perfect. Petra, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.